Thanks, Paul. Yes. He's professor of corporate communication at the Tech School of Business in Dartmouth, United States. So we will go as follows. I will shortly introduce Professor Argenti to you. Thereafter, he will present for the next 30-35 minutes. And afterwards, we have room for discussion and questions. If you have a question, you can raise your hand in the chat box, or you can type in your question there. And after the presentation, we will call out your name. And then if you can unmute yourself, introduce yourself shortly and raise your question to the professor live. So let's kick off. I will shortly introduce Professor Argenti to you. He has been teaching in our program for nearly 20 years. We will celebrate his lustrum next year with us. And we are very proud to have him in our program, teaching 2 classes on crisis communication and leadership communication. Professor Argenti is a true pioneer in the field of communication and teaching some of the earliest courses on the subject for Harvard Business School, Columbia Business School, and now at the Tech School of Business. And this summer, he will also reprint one of his first articles published in HBR. He is always ahead of the curve. For me, I think for most people, he's one of the most well-known and appreciated academics in the field of communication, and specifically in the field of crisis communication. He has been researching this field for a very long time, and he has published countless case studies, articles in the influential journal like the Mid-Sloan Management and HBR, in which his latest article on communicating through the coronavirus crisis is published as well, and what the subject is of the webinar today. So Professor Argenti, are you ready to kick off?
I'm ready. I'm ready when you are, Marika. Thank you so much.
Yeah, good.
Excellent. Well, welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. And I decided to write this article, Communicating Through the Coronavirus, early on. I started writing it in early March after I received phone calls from some colleagues in Japan and other parts of Asia. I hadn't really realized what was going on and decided that it was a good idea to just try to get something out there really quickly, because just having written the article that Marika talked about back in after 9/11, I think I had seen how people deal with cataclysmic events and thought there'd be some good lessons there. So as she said, that article, the crisis communication article, which was my first big Harvard Business Review article, is going to be reprinted in a special issue this summer, along with a lot of other articles on crisis. And the article that I published back on March 13th, Communicating Through the Coronavirus, is in an ebook now with a whole bunch of other really interesting articles on dealing with the crisis. So if you're interested in any of that, a lot of that material is available online directly from Harvard Business Review. What I wanted to do today was to talk to you about a few different things, and I want to start with looking at crisis as opportunity. And those of you who had me in class, had me as a professor in class, know that this is something I believe in very, very strongly. I think that, and it was hard to talk about this in relation to the coronavirus because my editor said, you know, you really don't want to present it that way, but that's exactly the way I want you to think about it, as every crisis presents itself as an opportunity. I also want to talk to you about this notion of building an adaptive organization out of this and thinking about how things will look when we come out of the crisis. We'll then talk about communication planning and goal setting, which for those of you who've had me in class will be a bit of review, like maybe 5 minutes. And then I'm going to get to the meat of the discussion. Maybe 20 minutes of my talk will be focused on the article that I wrote, Communicating Through the Coronavirus Crisis, with additional examples that I've added. I've done this seminar now in Italy and have done it for our alumni here at Tuck. I've done it for healthcare professionals. So I did it in Turkey last week. So I've got a lot of good examples to share. Then we'll get into some key takeaways and get into a discussion. So let me start with this idea of, let me go back, as crisis as opportunity. And I show this slide a lot in my classes because I think this notion of, when written in Chinese, the word crisis is composed of 2 characters. One represents danger and the other represents opportunity. If we all focus only on the danger, we're all going to go mad. I read an article the other day that said that 50% of Americans, fully 50% of Americans, are now facing mental health issues. Half of all Americans. And a lot of that is because people are fixated on this crisis. They're home alone, or they're not focused on anything else besides work and home and that kind of thing. And we really need to try to break out of that and see what is the opportunity for us. Is there personal growth that will come out of this? Is there growth for our company? The way we are presenting ourselves gives us an opportunity to show what we're made of. So many, many things could come out of this, and I want to start with that. The second thing that I wanted to talk about is this concept that grows out of material that we cover in my class called predictable surprise. And the idea here is that you should have seen this coming. Whether you could have seen this kind of a cataclysmic event or not is up for grabs, but potential threats like this emerge all the time. So the big question is, and we're not going to talk about this today, would love to talk about it further another time, can you recognize those threats and prioritize and mobilize to prevent them from hurting you? So can you avoid a crisis? But if something bad happens, do you have the capacity to respond? So do you have a good crisis management plan in place? That's kind of 101 crisis. The key is, once you've avoided the threats or actually managed the crises, do you learn and disseminate key insights to your team, organizational learning? Maybe better to show it in this format, which was designed by a couple of colleagues previously. And I think it really shows you the way that we ought to be thinking about it. We should try to avoid getting into crisis in the first place, but whether we do avoid it or not, we need to learn from every single crisis. And I think if we look at what's going on right now, what are we learning from it? What does it mean about our organization? What does it mean about the kind of leadership we have in place? Are our communication systems where they should be? And we could say the same thing for operational and financial issues that have developed. Jack Welch, who actually just died recently, I had the good pleasure of working with for many years, both when he was at GE and after he retired, said, an organization's ability to learn and translate that learning into action rapidly is the ultimate competitive advantage. So you do not want to miss this opportunity to learn. Let me move on to the plan. And I think, during this crisis in particular, everyone should have an approach to managing media relations. This is review for most of you, I'm sure, a strategy for how you notified your employees, where the location is, an official version of your plan. All of that is kind of basic stakes, but your goals in this crisis or any other one is first and foremost to regain the trust of whoever the key constituents are around the globe, because a lot of people are wondering what's happened to the organization, and they want to be able to count on these organizations, whether they're visibly in front of them or not. The second point is to leverage the situation, which gets back to that opportunity, to gain a competitive advantage and build reputational capital by addressing whatever changes you're putting in place in a responsible and thoughtful way. And then finally, to resolve whatever issues are still in place and not just put a what I call a Band-Aid solution, like a one-time solution into the mix. So again, this is review, and we're not going to go through this a lot, but I do want to use it as an example. When we talk about communicating during a crisis, the very first thing that I talk to people about is, have you clearly defined the problem? And again, I don't want to get lost in the weeds on what crisis communication should be about, but I'm surprised at how few people realize what the actual problem is. So in many communications that I've seen, companies will send out notes about their financial distress, for instance. Let's focus on that. And in one case, a senior manager at an organization sent out a note to everyone, all of the employees, saying, things are getting bad and they're going to get worse. And we're not going to talk about it today, but in the next few days, you're going to hear more about how horrifying it's going to be. Well, if you looked at what the actual problem is that you have, is it just a financial problem? Or do you have an emotional problem and a fear problem on the part of most of your workers? You might have dealt with that a little bit differently. Another organization, as an example, that I work with here in the United States, a consulting firm that focuses on social impact, decided, you know what, we all know there's financial problems, and you're right, we are having them as well. We're going to fall off a cliff in 3 months because we're not replenishing our our clients because of the crisis. But one of the things they said, and I thought this was really, really important to say, was we're all going to take a pay cut. The senior management team is taking a third of a pay cut all the way down. As we get to $75,000, you will have no pay cut. And we're going to use that money to keep the business going beyond the next 3 months. After that, we'll get back to you. Now, instead of saying it's going to be bad information and it's going to be horrible, even though you know you have a financial problem, you're telling people what the solution is, because the bigger problem is the emotional impact this is having on your employees. Again, the last bullet point here, keep the business running. I always use as an example Mary Barra when she came in as CEO at GM. She put everyone on her senior management team in charge of the ignition crisis, which in some ways she had caused as head of the engineering division. But I always thought that's a terrible thing to do. Like, you have to have someone who's thinking about running the business. During this crisis, I think it's really important to admit to everyone that this is not business as usual. And that would be true no matter which constituency we're talking about, with your employees, with your customers. When I watch television here in the United States and I see advertisements that act as if we're all still running around and getting together and having parties and stuff, I realize that these people are completely tuned out in terms of understanding what people are going through. The second thing is to explain, what are you doing to mitigate the crisis? What is the plan that you have? And here, I will talk about this more when we get to my specific pieces of information related to the article I wrote. That means telling people the why, not just the what. And I think often people are just saying, here's what we're doing, without explaining the why. So we'll get to that in a moment. Discuss how you're going to address those problems. And then finally, such an important point, assure everyone things are going to get better. You know, I'm rereading a book that I read in college called Journal of the Plague Year, written by Daniel Defoe at the beginning of the 18th century about the plague in the 17th century. You read that book, it's almost like exactly what's happening now. Everybody had to stay home and a lot of people died. They got out of that. Life went on, you know, it wasn't like the UK folded up and went away. We're all going to get beyond this. There's going to be a time following this. You have to get people focused on that to a certain extent as well. So the article that I wrote, Communicating Through the Coronavirus Crisis, again, it's available online. You should be able to get it easily. And I believe, Marika, we can give people access to that, both through the ebook that came out and through the article after the session. But I wanted to go through each of the steps that I wrote about in the article and talk a little bit more about how we think about this. And, you know, basically, one of the things that we start with is having a centralized comms team. By now, all of you have to have that in place. But what is so interesting to me was, as I started to investigate this, I noticed that there were companies that had a standing pandemic team in place. And one of the ones that I wrote about in the article is Intel. They had a standing pandemic leadership team before this even started. These people were ready to go when this happened. It wasn't like we haven't had warning signs before. We had SARS, we had, you know, a whole bunch of other things that happened that companies that were smart put in place ahead of time a standing committee. And that's basically going back to, are you ready for a crisis? Have you basically put in place the mechanisms to try to make sure everything is where it needs to be? The second thing that I'd say about this, having a centralized group, is that the team needs to be small. In many cases, I've observed companies and have counseled companies over the last month or so, they have teams of 25, 30 people. Maybe you have subgroups of the main team, but you need to have a 5 to 7 person team that is meeting regularly, parsing information, trying to monitor the situation as it continues to evolve. And that team, that small team, needs to be the central source of information about the crisis. You cannot have multiple voices speaking about the same crisis. Classic example, I'm sure many of you, even though you live in the Netherlands, have followed what's going on in the United States. Our president is completely, flying in the face of any idea about this. He has a team, it's very large. They give briefings once a day, which is great. But then members of the team go off onto other media outlets and say different things about what they think about the crisis. maniacal consistency, focus on the information so that people don't get confused is really critical here. Regular updates, another part of creating that centralized team and letting it do its work. Why do we want regular updates? Because even if you don't know all of the answers, or you don't even know how you're going to deal with some of the answers, keeping people abreast that you're focusing on these things and will get to an answer is better than saying nothing. It doesn't have to be all packaged up and perfect before you communicate. You want to be as transparent as you possibly can here. And I think this is just basic crisis strategy. Explain what you know, what you don't know, what your sources of information are. So, when the president of the United States says that we expect cases to be between 100 and 240, the media immediately said, where did you get those numbers from? No one at the NIH said that. No one in the CDC said that. We've not met a doctor who can corroborate that evidence. So if you're saying something, you better make sure, especially in this day and age with social media, that you're backing it up with where that information came from. And then finally, and most importantly, and it harkens back to other articles I've written before, be succinct. We're getting emails from people in many organizations. They go on for way past the scroll button. You need to put the main point in the subject if it's an email, summarize in the first few sentences what the point is, and have click-throughs to more of the information that's coming later. Be succinct. Long, turgid messages, especially written by health professionals or lawyers or people who are not really equipped at communication, will not be read or easily understood, and actually are quite confusing. Second point is actually the first thing that everybody should have focused on. And if you're not already completely immersed in this, focus on your employees. Your employees, and if the United States is any indication, maybe people in the United States are crazier than they are in the Netherlands. There's a high percentage of people in Holland, in the Netherlands, in Europe. I did one of these in Italy, talking with people in Italy about it. Certainly people are shut in at home. They're challenged and emotionally distraught by what is going on. So how are you thinking about your most important constituency, and how are you getting them to function as ambassadors when they are personally facing challenges as well? Maybe their challenges are financial. Maybe their challenges are actually contracting the disease. But these are people who are right in the crosshairs of this problem, and you need to demystify the situation for your employees. You need to try to get rid of the stress as much as you can. And the way to get rid of stress is to give them some sense of certainty. And as I said before, everyone's mind needs to be put at ease. And you need to provide hope for the future. In our classes that we do on leadership at Erasmus, and that I do here at Tuck in our executive programs, we talk a lot about this notion of how to communicate with people during transformation. And I think transformational communication is the kind of communication that you should be thinking about here, because it has the same kind of focus. We need to make sure that we are providing hope for the future, even when we don't know what that future is going to look like. Because if you get people caught up in the danger and not the opportunity, you're going to lose them. And I think here what we see is harkens back to the article that I wrote for Harvard Business Review on 9/11. And in that time, I did research on people who had lived through 9/11, and the article was published in 2002. And one of the most important findings I had in relation to employee communication was that people wanted to hear directly from leadership. They were looking to hear from the leaders to understand what was going on. And they were the best source of reduction in anxiety. And I think if employees are wanting to hear from the leader, you need to be able to give them that person in terms of what's going on. As I wrote about in the article, when this first developed here at the Tuck School, our MBA program office stationed themselves in a very central location so people could answer questions, and they were ready to communicate as fast and as quickly as they possibly could. But we see lots of examples that don't make sense here as well. Hyatt, which is a hotel chain here in the United States, basically everyone in senior leadership took a pay cut like the kind that I talked about before, but they're going to gain because they also took stock options. They're going to vest when the market goes through the roof, and they're going to end up being super wealthy. What kind of a signal does that send to your employees? Another company that will remain nameless They told everybody they couldn't fly anymore, and then they started to hire private jets to fly the senior leadership around. And that kind of mixed messaging that goes on is very, very confusing to people. So I think one of the things to focus on is your employees and their anxiety. But another is just to think logically about, if you put yourself in their shoes, what would you like to know? Step 3, communicate regularly with customers. Customers require a different approach than employees. And I think we need to think about customers as different, because you don't have the same access to your customers that you do to your employees in terms of communication channels. And you don't also communicate with them with the same frequency. And you have to think about frequency and channel with customers in lots of different ways. So the first example that I want to talk about is to focus on what is important to the customer. And we saw some good examples of that. Actually, ING is one of the companies that I've been following on this, because ING put in place a mechanism to test people's temperatures in the lobbies of the organization. That's great. Also, they were able to extend loan terms to people right away during the early part of the crisis. Target, which is a big box store here in the United States, sent out a note from the CEO to customers describing how they were cleaning the stores early on, so people weren't afraid of going shopping in the stores. The second point, which I started to get into, is providing that relief to customers whenever possible. And the first company that did that here in the United States was JetBlue. JetBlue said, we're going to make everybody whole. If you have a flight with us, we're going to give you a refund, no questions asked. And actually, and a lot of these airlines are providing, their frequent flyer miles to people for another year and things like that. But this move went a long way, reassuring customers that everything is going to be okay. We're not going to hold you accountable, as compared to some of the other things that companies have done, including recently American Airlines. And those of you who follow my work know that I've written and taught about United Airlines' ridiculous behavior. But American Airlines, a couple of weeks ago, had 11 people on board its plane. And, we're obviously all employing, social distancing. They put all 11 customers in the back of the plane jammed together. And when customers started to complain, they said, well, we can't upgrade you because you only paid for a cheap seat. Not realizing that what they were doing was, potential lawsuits, not to mention spread of the disease, and just that kind of mindless stupidity with customers, rather than providing obvious relief, comes out of bureaucracy that needs to be cut down right away when you're dealing with your customers. 3, focus on empathy here. And I think rather than trying to create selling opportunities right now, we all need to think about being more empathetic towards our customers. You should rethink your advertising and promotion strategies. Here in the United States, I think the most forward-thinking companies are doing that in their advertising. We see big car companies doing this by saying, we'll deliver the car to you. You won't have to pay anything for 90 days. We're giving you financing at, very, very low cost, and trying to reassure people that you're meeting them where they are. And we see lots of companies doing that with their customers. I thought ING's report, which came out on March 17th, a very good presentation that really put together their plan, helped to ensure, reassure customers that they were helping them and providing flexibility in the loans and so forth. And I think this kind of thing goes a long way. In Italy, one of the big Italian utilities basically did the same thing around, don't worry about paying your bill right now. We'll catch up later on that. But this goes back to communicating with customers, goes back to the case, which I teach in my class that most people know of, Johnson & Johnson's Tylenol incident. It isn't like we don't know how to deal with customers in a crisis. Go back to the core case and you'll see a great example of how to do it right and to keep doing it right. Step 4, reassure shareholders. I did an interview just yesterday with the Washington Post here in the United States. And in that interview, we talked a lot about earnings season is just coming on. How do we talk to our shareholders about this? Well, with earnings season just around the corner, I think publicly listed companies have a special responsibility to communicate the impact of the virus on their operations. There's a great site that I mentioned in the article from Skadden, which is a law firm that talks about consideration in relation to SEC disclosures if you're traded in the United States, that I think would be useful for you to read, whether you're trading in the United States or only in the Netherlands. And there's also a report that I mentioned in the article from a managing director at a consulting firm in Hong Kong who gave some really good advice. And she said, be transparent in communicating near-term challenges. There shouldn't be any surprises for your shareholders. Use the crisis as an opportunity to reinforce the corporation's long-term fundamentals and communicate what you're doing about the problem. That's really what people are looking for. And I think you need to pay attention to travel guidance and make sure everybody is following those rules. The last point that I want to make here is to be proactive with the communities in which you operate. Great example to start with, two really bad examples from Europe actually to start with. One is Adidas, and many of you saw that Adidas refused to pay rent on its stores when the crisis started. They were shamed into eventually paying rent. H&M did the same thing, and this is not the way to do it. Instead, you have companies like Starbucks, which are providing free coffee to people who are on the front lines, and companies, Pret-a-Manger in the UK is doing the same thing. You see companies that are trying to figure out, how can I help my community? What do you have that you can give them? You know, in New York is one of the hardest hit places right now in the United States. One of the biggest churches in the world, St. John the Divine, which is it was my church. You know, when I actually first started to go to church, St. John the Divine has opened up its whole huge church to St. Luke's Hospital, which is a nearby hospital, to be used as a 200 patient operation. And if what your organization can physically do, what you can provide to them in the way of materials, the kinds of things that you might be able to provide in terms of space and money, those are the things we're talking about. In Europe, one of the best examples early on was Unilever. They provided soap and sanitizer and bleach. They put 500 million euros into the value chain to try to help people within the value chain. And to me, that's the key, is trying to think of things that you can do. Zara making protective masks, and 3M, and some of these luxury brands like Givenchy or others who are providing, are making hand sanitizer. And I've told my other European friends, please save a bottle of LVMH or Givenchy hand sanitizer for when we get back to sanity. I think that's going to be a fun thing to have. But you see bad examples versus good examples, and providing resources such as cleaning supplies or food, providing information to the local media to help calm them down about what you're doing, and providing transparency about what's happening in your company rather than going radio silent. The community needs to hear from you as well. And I think that's this notion that is so important. Here in the United States, we heard from Cargill early on, which is a very large company. They have more than 50 business locations and more than 10,000 employees in China. And very early on, they made a donation of 2 million won to the Chinese Red Cross and sent hundreds of thousands of face masks to affected area. So what are the things that you can do to help the communities that are in need? So these are some of the examples that I talked about before, just to review those. I think I went over all of those. These are some of the bad examples that I went over before, and you can just review that later on. I'm sure we'll give you access to these slides and also to the recording. So let me give you some takeaways to think about, and then Marijke, get ready to fire up the first question for me. So one, think about the opportunity that comes with a crisis. This is not opportunistic thinking to try to take advantage of the crisis. It's to say, if all we focus on is the danger, are we really doing the best that we can by our employees, our customers, by our shareholders? Is there an opportunity for us to be a stronger organization as a result of this? And I want you to think about this in a more powerful way individually, which I'll talk about at the end. Second, Decentralized management is fine, but strategically aligned communications in a crisis is necessary to speak in harmony. Do not let people try to fool you into thinking, well, we can do our own thing. You cannot. You need to at least sound like you're singing from the same hymnal, if you will. Spotting predictable surprises can help avoid crises and present opportunities for how you can learn in a crisis. You need to think strategically about communications in the way that I just described in the article, and that you can study further in that article, and start learning now from this crisis and start creating communication plans for the next one when it's over. One of the thoughts that I want to leave you with, and it's a really important thought for everyone listening here. I'm not sure what it was like in the Netherlands, but I do know here in the United States, after World War II, I look at my parents' generation. They had lived through the Great Depression and World War II. We often call that generation here in the United States the greatest generation. Living through that kind of a crisis made them stronger. What is this going to be like for you? What kind of a legacy are you going to leave to your children and to the next generations? And there's a beautiful quote from Martin Luther King that I'd like you to think about. Only in the darkness can you see the stars. Many of us have never lived through anything like this before in our lives. Prior to this, my son, like the worst thing that ever happened to him was when my wife and I would go away for a night and he had to stay with his brother and a babysitter. Really think about how important it is to be able to put things in perspective and how much more perspective we all have now. So I want to thank you all for listening, and you can read more of my stuff, and I'm happy to talk more. And please, Marijke, let me know what some of the questions are that you'd like me to answer right now. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for your insights. Again, really amazing. So let's go to the Q&A. I have a first question from Stijn Peters. Can you unmute yourself and introduce yourself shortly and ask your question live to Professor Argenti?
Yes, hi, Marijke and Paul. Paul, thank you very much for this insightful presentation. I really liked those 5 steps and also the examples that you were giving. I had a couple of questions. I'm also doing some crisis communication advice in Belgium and a little bit in Europe here and there. Now, especially in this period of time, I'm focusing a lot on elderly homes, hospitals, and mental care in Belgium, because I think the need is there very urgent. And I see a lot of hopelessness and fear. And for me, I'm doing this for a couple, 15 years now. For me, that's very new kind of emotion. Normally sadness is in there, anger is in there, but now I see so much fear and hopelessness. It is very novel for me because normally if you have a fire, you can say, yeah, after 2 days, and if you have a strike, it will not go on for a week, but now we don't know. And that incites so much uncertainty, so much fear. That crisis communication is for me, it's a novelty. It's a novelty. Shouldn't we try to get a different kind of strategy for crisis communications now that we have this complex situation, instead of the more simple and the more compounded or complicated situations that we are used to deal with 99% of the time?
Yeah, no, it is different. And I think I tried to indicate exactly what you're talking about when I gave you those statistics. About 50% of people in the United States have mental health problems right now. And a lot of that has to be focused on this notion of people feeling helpless and hopeless and wondering about the future. You know, one of the things that I mentioned that I just want to stress again, and I think it'll be really helpful to you, is look at some of the literature around transformation and change. And if you look at some of the ways that we communicate about change and transformation, that's the kind of stuff that I think can be really helpful to people. And there are a couple of things that we talk about when I teach transformation in my classes. And one is that you have to have a narrative. You have to have a story that people can identify with. And, what will that new normal look like? We don't know. But there are things that we can be certain of. And one of those things I actually just did another interview with a writer who's writing a piece on teams for Harvard Business Review that'll come out in a week or two. And we talked about this idea of making sure the team has some idea of what you're thinking, that this is the way you're thinking. And I'll give you an example of a firm that, that I mentioned before that gave everyone a pay cut, and it was based on how much you're making and then scaled down. And one of the things that they did was really focus on the why. They basically gave insight into the financial ramifications of what they're doing, and they plotted out what their business was going to look like 3 months from now and saying, this is why we're doing what we're doing right now. Our expectation is that this is what's going to happen after that, and to provide hope. Here in the United States, we get great hope from, you know, our the head of the NIH saying, you know, we think there's going to be a start to the school year in September. At least there's some light at the end of the tunnel. And so I think whatever you can provide in the way of light at the end of the tunnel is the place where I would start. But remember what I said before. You want to give people a sense of hope for the future. Yes, it's bad right now. It is not always going to be bad. People have lived through things like this before. We lived through the financial crisis. People lived through the Great Depression. My God, in the Netherlands, you lived through the war. I'm reading a book with my son about, you know, what it was like for children in the Netherlands during the war, and he couldn't believe it. You lived through, people have lived through far worse than this and gotten to the other side. You need to focus on the hope and the things that you can provide certainty about with people, and update that regularly. Keep updating that as much as you can. Marika, next question.
Yes, the next question is from Anna. So Anna, can you please unmute yourself?
I did. Can you hear me?
Good.
Yes.
Yes,
Hi,
we
Anna.
do.
How are you?
Hi. Hi, thank you, Paul, and thank you, Marika, for this great opportunity to actually hear Paul online once again. I have a question which is more like I don't know how to call it, whether I'd probably say it's kind of a technical, and it's more on internal communications for a large company. With the new evidence and new, disputes around the threat of coronavirus emerging, and with this discussion and dialogue and actually disputes whether or not the total lockdown was the right thing to do, whether or not Sweden is right or, Germany is right, or whether or not it's really that deadly. There's a lot of talk out there. What do you think as a leader of, let's say, a large organization that has to work, okay? I mean, there are a lot of organizations out there that they have their staff coming and going. As a leader, how do you actually navigate through this information, and how do you guide your own staff about what to do and how to take it, and being over alarmist or being a little more calm than everyone else around? How do you navigate through this information about whether or not this was an overreaction from the government or it wasn't? And what are you going to do in your own organization in internal communication?
There are several things that you're bringing up, Anna, which I'm not surprised, and it's good to hear from you again after all these years. But one of the things that I would say is, we need to make sure that we're relying on the best information possible. You need to have access, if you're a leader, to the best information out there from your country. And the last thing that you want to do is second guess your government. And this presents a tricky problem for people like Dr. Fauci here in the United States, who's the chief scientist, who has to listen to President Trump every day and counteract everything that he's saying practically. The numbers, take this drug, all kinds of crazy stuff. But one of the things that you want to do is to provide the best information from your country that you possibly can. You go back to the 17th century, they knew that the best thing to do is stay at home. I mean, this is advice that people have been focused on when plagues have come before. This is the best advice. Here in the United States, people who are second guessing that, like the governor of Florida, who still lets people go to church even though they have a shut-in policy. It's absolutely crazy. Those states are seeing the biggest rise. There's just compelling evidence that that is a no-brainer. And you need to rely on real science, not fake, junk science from people who are trying to, put their own agenda forward or trying to keep an economy afloat. The problem is not an economic or financial problem. It's a health problem. When there is a health problem, we rely on health professionals, not financial or economics professionals, to tell us what to do. Oddly enough, when you look at the smartest minds in the world, the people who are like the Goldman Sachses who are putting out studies, they're all aligned with the healthcare professionals who are at the top of their game. So I don't think there should be any dissonance there, Anna, between what a reasonable government is saying. If you have an unreasonable government that's questioning that, as in Florida, those numbers are going to just be startling to them down the road. And it's a shame to have to prove them wrong in the way that will have to happen, which is people are going to die. So I think the numbers will bear out in the end, the truth will come out. But one of the things you have to do is have good information. And as a leader, it's your job to have the right information and to communicate that to everyone and be reinforcing, wash your hands, social distancing, stay at home. The best companies were quickly setting up home operations for their employees, telling them what the dangers are of coming to work, and those kinds of things for everyone. Thank you for your question, and it's good to hear from you.
Thank you.
Okay, Marika.
So the next question is from Abdallah. Abdallah, can you unmute yourself?
Yes. Hey guys, good to be here. Thank you. My name is Abdallah Touqan. I look after change and transformation communication globally for Audits Group. Professor, we have actually come across your article at the beginning of the outbreak of the COVID, and actually we did follow all the steps. And I will get to a point right now after step number 5. Is now we have in full, working from home capacity, everything has been done for customers and shareholders, but now this is our new normal. Now we need to accept the fact we do not know when will this unique situation will end. So now this is the new normal, and we need to start living with that to ensure business continuity. Now, here's the challenge, and I want some advice or tips on that. To communicate the new normal to the staff or the customers or shareholders. Like, for example, if the metrics are down, do we adjust our targets? If we need to do that, how will that affect us as a business? And will this also contradict what we were trying to say a couple of weeks ago about just ensuring our employees are safe, customers are safe? That's the first priority. But now everyone is safe. We need to move on with the cycle. We need to get the business going again. Everybody is equipped at home with internet access. Everyone is working. I want to ensure business continuity, but I don't want to look like a hypocrite. Does that make sense? And I want some advice.
It makes total sense. And I think one of the things that I hope, Abdullah, you understand from what I'm saying is that you need to be transparent, but you also need to be keeping people on the same page that you are, which is based on what we know now. We have to go back and change our policy. So for instance, here in my town, during the first couple of weeks, children were still going to school, and the superintendent was writing notes saying, we see no reason to close the schools. Once the governor said you have to close the schools, he had to say, we're closing the schools. And I think understanding that this is a dynamic situation that is still evolving, there is no normal yet, and there may never be things going back to exactly the way they were before. But one of the things we know for sure is that it is an evolving situation. And when you are in an evolving situation, whether we go back to the first studies I did on this with 3 Mile Island, for instance, you have to say to people, based on what we know right now, this is what we see happening for the next couple of weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. We will update you when that changes. We feel confident that this is true for now. We don't feel confident about it being true forever. And I used to teach a case for many years about McDonald's when they were working on their packaging, and they had a policy in place called QSCV, which was basically a way for them to think about quality, service, and and value in the way they were presenting to customers that I think is really useful here. And that is that we're constantly updating what we should be doing and what we should be thinking and how we should be working based on the best evidence that we have, which means that we're in a dynamic situation. This is not like an engineering problem where we have a problem and a solution in 3 steps and we're done, or even that you follow my 5 steps and you're done, but that the situation will continue to evolve, which means that you actually have to think and you have to try to readjust as the situation changes. And giving people a heads up about that's what's going on is more useful than trying to give them certainty now and forever. There is no such thing. There is now, and then there's 2 weeks from now. We are right at the crest. I think the crest here in the United States is going to happen next Friday, from what I understand, where the peak will happen. And that's what we think. But when we look at what has happened in the past, that could be later, it could be sooner. So updating information to people, based on that, we think we're going to be have our offices closed until May 3rd. You know, when we get to April 17th and we see what's happening, we'll update you. Here at school, you know, we haven't announced whether we're getting, you know, we're eliminating graduation yet or not. Some schools have because they have graduation in May. We told them we will let you know on April 20th what our decision is. So telling people that we don't know the answer, but we'll know the answer by this date, or this is the answer that we have now, we'll be able to update that later, is the way to deal with that kind of a problem. And that really should hold true for any decision that you're making. Don't try to give people a sense that this is what we're doing, we're stuck with that forever. A lot of those decisions that were made early on were bad decisions for now. They were good decisions for then, not so good now. Marika?
Yes, Wise Song Su, I hope I say your name correctly.
Yes.
Mute yourself. Good.
Okay, yes, thank you, Paul. Thank you, Marika. Yeah, it's a very, very insightful presentation. Thank you. I just got 2 questions. So first is because now I'm in a multinational corporate, I'm in the internal communication team, and we just found that doing communication effectively during this period is quite hard for us. Why? Because all the situation in different countries are so different. So for example, now the Europe and the US just start to preparing to dealing with COVID-19, but in China, they already experienced that, like 2 months ahead before us. So the information we deliver is useful maybe in US or in Europe, but for them, it's just not useful anymore. Yeah, it's quite hard for us to stay then engaged and participate and deliver the right information for them. So that is the first question. The second question is, do you have some specific tips or points that's about manager crisis communication? Because they are our focal points to communicate with all the employees, right? They are very important, and we also believe that the employees really look for their managers to send them the right, precise, and transparent information. But how can we enhance the communication to managers to our internal communication team as a team?
Where is your corporation located, just so I understand the situation?
Yeah. The headquarters is in Houston, but I'm working in Rotterdam.
Okay. Yeah, so I think you brought up something that I think is worth spending a little bit of time on. So for multinational companies that are dealing with this across several different locations, this crisis, I think, presents a really fascinating challenge. The case that has come up that is maybe the most interesting, the global company here in the United States that operates in China and Italy and other places, 3M, and how they're dealing with the distribution of masks. And I think that this is true for every corporation like that. You're going to have a policy in place that you can talk about globally, but then you need to implement it locally. If I understand your question correctly, it's how do we deal with the communications to managers so they can speak directly to the people who report to them. Again, if we have kind of a global strategy for what we're doing, and then we adapt it to the local market, the manager is the right person to deliver that message. That doesn't mean there isn't a message that comes out from the CEO first. I think the CEO comes out with a message. Maybe the task force comes out with a message. But then each individual manager talks to his or her team, his or her unit about what's going on and translates that. And again, this is where my comment that I made before, that it's like speaking in harmony, meaning it has to sound like you're allied to that theme, like at least like the song sounds like the same song. Maybe there's a slightly different modulation to it because you're in China or you're in US or you're in Texas versus New York, but essentially the same messages apply. And if I understand your question correctly, I think it's that in internal communications, you're absolutely right. One of the things we know from all of our research is that people want to hear directly from their manager. So you need to arm those managers with the information from the task force to give to their individual employees. And people are doing that pretty regularly. Like they get a message from on high, it goes to everyone, there's a to all, but then they have individual meetings with their units and talk about this is what it means for us, because there's a big difference between people who are on the shop floor in a manufacturing facility versus or in an oil company, between people who are upstream or downstream. So you have to tailor those messages accordingly. Marika?
Yes, the next one is Ger Perbo. Are you still there?
Yes, I'm still there. Thank you.
Good.
Good evening.
How are you here? It's good to see you. I saw you before. I saw a glimpse of you before and hear from you again. Where are you living these days?
I'm at this moment in Abu Dhabi, working as a Vice President Communication for Healthcare for Mubadala, one of the biggest investment companies over here. And I'm really impressed, by the way, to see how here in the Middle East, they really use the kind of opportunities. Simple example, 3 months ago, talking about working from home was a no-go area. You even wouldn't bring that up. It was non-negotiable. What you see today, 80–90% of the people are working from home. And the most beautiful thing is, it's successful. And I'm pretty sure that after this crisis, this never goes away. This stays. This is the way of how you see opportunities. But the question I want to focus on is a different one, much more focused on Europe. You were saying speaking in harmony, and I really like that. But if I look then to Europe, and specifically the European Union, which had the great opportunity to operate in harmony, we saw this crisis coming, and the first thing they did, every country, rather than starting to work together, started to work on their own, closed their borders. If you look to the Netherlands, the borders to Belgium are really closed, and the Belgians are very serious about it. The border to Germany is almost closed. Is there still an opportunity for Europe to really look into this and really create a kind of opportunity after this crisis? Because I'm a little bit afraid that this will have a push back on Europe rather than being an opportunity.
Yeah. Well, here, as always, you challenge me to think beyond what I normally would think about. But I guess the easiest way for me to think about this is, when it comes right down to it, it's the same thing here in the United States, by the way. Some states are not, people from New York are not being allowed into other states right now. And I think that when you look at something like this, like a pandemic, if there's a way, somebody needs to put on their mute. Please make sure you have your mute buttons on. Somebody please put your mute button on. Jess, why don't you go through and see who that is, and you can mute them. But one of the things that we know is, that basically you have to do what's best for society as a whole. And right now we're looking at society as a whole very, very selfishly, and not, it really kind of exposes the strange nature of the European Union, I think, and of the United States, if you will, when it's really a state-by-state operation right now. Like each state, because of the way Trump is managing this crisis, is operating like a separate country. The governor is in charge of everything. The federal government won't provide basically, the stockpile that they have. Donald Trump's son-in-law said that stockpile is for us, and everybody's wondering, like, who the hell is us if it's not the states? But it's the same thing in the European Union. There is a European Union for lots of things, But when it comes to a pandemic, each of you have to operate separately. I think that presents an interesting challenge from a communication standpoint. So what it means is that if we operate across multiple borders in a country like the United States or in an area like the European Union, what are the ways to think about that from a communication standpoint? You should be able to iron that out a lot more easily than you can like the kind of restrictions that are put in place from a healthcare perspective on borders. An individual city might be blocked off as Wuhan was in China, or as New York should be and is in the United States. But I think that, you know, how that affects communication is a little bit of a mystery to me. It isn't directly related to crisis communication as much as it is to both political and decision-making authority and governance in a body like the European Union or the United States. Marijke, I think we have time for one more question. Let's squeeze one more in if we could.
Difficult to choose. We had lots left.
One.
Sarah, are you still there? Sarah Magdalena? No. Luke Willets?
Yep, she's right there. Go ahead, Sarah.
Oh, go ahead.
Thank you. I didn't find the unmute button.
Got it.
Yeah.
You were just on time.
Yes. So in a sense, I'm tying to Ger's question here, because we can also see now how certain countries are looking at easing out the measures they have taken. Up until now, it has been relatively binary. It's like stay at home and that's it. End of story. Now, for instance, in Denmark, they see that, yeah, well, you know, we're going to ease in. We're opening the kindergartens because it has proven perhaps not be the most efficient, or we can do it in the situation we're in. So my basic question, I think, is really, how do you communicate almost?
What do you mean?
Or does that tie down into your earlier reasoning about how you are clear, how you say, okay, this is the current state we are at now in 2 weeks, and then 2 weeks later, well, things have changed, and this is the new normal for these 2 coming weeks?
Yeah, I think I would avoid using the word normal at all with people right now. I don't know that there is anything approaching normality for anyone. But you know, that's the best thing that I can say. Like, as of right now, you know, we have all schools closed here, and they're closed, I think, till May 3rd or something like that. There's no expectation that that's going to open up and that kids are going to go back to school, not here in the United States anyway. So I think if you as a communicator can provide the certainty of updates, that's a huge certainty. Like, you're going to hear from us regularly. We will provide updates on this particular situation every 2 weeks. We'll provide updates on this every day. We will provide updates on this, you know, at the end of the month, and give people the certainty of more information coming in this dynamic situation, rather than a false hope or any, you know, a lot of people made huge pronouncements about we'll never do this or we'll do that, and we also need to react to what others are doing. If Denmark opens up its kindergartens, what does that mean for the rest of the Nordics? You know, is that going to affect them in some way? And will all of this bounce back again and reappear? And you have no idea what the ramifications are of each of these decisions. So all you can do is exactly what I said before. Try to give people reassurance about when you will have information or how you're thinking about developing information. And then when you give them the information, talk about not just the what, but the why and the how. Really give them all of the details in a way that you normally wouldn't, probably.
Yeah, I get that. At the same time, at the current state, people are so worried. So if you say maybe, or this is how it is today, unless you can be almost categorically, this is the truth, as you know, you almost cause more upheaval or more worry, because yes, I fully agree with you that tell people as much information as you have at this moment and be transparent.
Yeah, there's an old saying around crisis communication that I will reiterate here: tell it all and tell it fast. But in this case, I think one of the messages needs to be, this is what we know now. And I can assure you that as of today, this is what we know, but we are in a dynamic situation where we can't predict the future. And people just have to, live with that. I think the reassurance of knowing that an update is coming, or that there's an endpoint to this particular part of the crisis, or that we have a way of thinking about it, that kind of reassurance actually, I think, is one way to provide comfort to people. But look, let me just end with this thought to everyone. We are in an unprecedented and an unusual situation. And, it's Sarah Magdalena, I mean, it kind of reminds me, like in 1943, what could you say about World War II to your employees, your kids? We didn't know what the end was going to look like. And we're kind of in a war in a way that we really don't know, when is the enemy going to strike next, and what is the end point going to look like? So we've got to be a little bit more flexible. And I think I said right up front, trying to reassure people, trying to provide hope for the future, trying to be as transparent as possible, trying to provide as much information that that you're certain about, trying to assuage their fear and not be holding back information. That's the best you can do. You can't make a soap purse out of a sow's ear. And I think that's really where we are right now. So my heart goes out to all of you. I wish we had more time. I thank you all for coming today. I hope this was useful. We should be able to provide links. There's a special issue coming out in the summer on crisis from Harvard Business Review. Look for that. The ebook is fabulous, and I think it's available to subscribers for free, maybe even free to everyone right now. It's an ebook from Harvard Business Review on the COVID crisis and how to respond, including my article and 30 other great articles. So take a look at that. Marika, thank you. I enjoyed it very much. I hope you did too.
I did. Thank you. Really, thank you for your brilliant presentation and Q&A, Paul. I loved it. And I think all the comments, everyone is very happy with everything you shared and talked about.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So thank you. Really, thanks for your time. Yeah, I think it's very insightful. Yeah.
Excellent. Let's get back together when things are normal, whenever that is, huh?
Yeah, exactly.
Hope to see many of you in Rotterdam again sometime.
Hopefully we see you in September.
I'll be there if I can.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks again, Paul, for your presentation and Q&A. And thank you all for joining. And stay safe and healthy. And we hope to see you soon again. I think that's it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.